Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, I'm going to create some floral cards using the new Spotlight Frames and Florals collection from Lisa Horton and Spellbinders. They sent some over to create with and share with you, and I absolutely love the beautiful florals in the collection as well as the unique background pieces. There's also a smile die set that has 3 different layers to it with a sentiment. There's also a hello one as well. Mine hasn't arrived yet, so I'll be using the smile for all of the cards here. And I love how within one set you get the main sentiment, which is the smile with the layers, as well as some sub-sentiments to go with it and dies that work with them as well. So anytime I have collections like these, like florals with die cuts that are going to be die cut out of a bunch of different colors, what I typically do is I pick all of my colors, I lay out the dies on each one of the colors they're going to go with, and then I get die cutting. I usually die cut as many as I need for the card, and sometimes I'll do a few extras as well, just so that I don't have to stop and die cut something extra if I change what I have in my head to go with it. So once I have my die cuts done, I can use my grip mat and start to do some ink blending. I love using ink blending, especially with different die cuts, because it adds some very simple dimension and it's very, very easy to do. I'm using some detailed ink blending brushes here. These ones that I use come in 3 different sizes, so I can pick and choose what size is best for the project that I'm working on. For these florals, these ones are the anemones. I started with some light purple cardstock as well as white cardstock, and I'm ink blending with the same wilted violet ink pad. I like the different look between the purple around the edges and the white around the edges. It gives a little bit of variation, and the only thing I changed was the cardstock that I started with. By starting with colored cardstock, I save time with my ink blending because I don't have to do quite as much. My purple cardstock here is Purple Mist from Spellbinders. The rest of it is just some scraps that I have, and a lot of us have a ton of cardstock scraps. Die cuts or die sets like these are perfect to use up those scrap pieces. And you can even use different tones from the same color just to give a little bit of color variation. The ink color that I used to blend on my green there was Bundled Sage. And then I cut some dark gray for the center of the flowers. And I'm just using some black distress ink to do my ink blending around these. And I'm only doing it around the outside edges. These centers have 2 layers to it. I'm only doing it to the larger layer. Once I have those die cuts ink blended, I can start to assemble. So I like to lay out my pieces here just so that I make sure that I have the right layers together. Especially with the flowers, there's one flower that's a little bit bigger and has 2 pieces, and one that's a little bit smaller and has 2 pieces. And by laying them out, I know while I'm assembling them that I'm assembling the ones that I want to assemble together, and I'm not going to accidentally assemble something that I don't want together, like a large piece with a smaller piece. So by laying it all out completely, I have everything organized. I'm also using a jewel picker in order to pick up the teeny tiny second layer die cut for the centers of my flowers. You could also use a set of tweezers, but I found that the jewel picker worked perfectly and did exactly what I needed it to do. For my flowers, like I said, I have them all laid out, so all I'm going to do is add a little bit of glue in the center of the flower, and then I can put my layers together. It doesn't really matter if you put or which layer you put on top of each other. What I did is I put one on top and then one behind, so there was just some slight variation with the flowers. And because there's only 2 pieces to those petals, they were really easy to put together. Once those petals and the base of the flower is put together, I just put a little bit of glue in the center of the flower and then added my center. Like most of my videos, I'm using Barely Art glue in a fine tip bottle. This way I can use the same glue for assembling die cuts like this or assembling larger pieces on my card. It's nice and handy, and I love the fact that it doesn't take too long and the cardstock starts to hold. Literally within about, I want to say about 10 seconds, it starts to hold and grab. This die cut here is the Woven Lattice Texture die cut, and I'm using black soot as well as Hickory Smoke Distress ink to ink blend the background here. I don't want one solid color. If I wanted one solid color, it would be best to use some colored cardstock here. I wanted to have a little bit of color variation and have that woven texture blend well with my die cuts. So before I start to assemble my card, I want to get my sentiments stamped out. This is a brand new stamp set, so before I do anything with it, I take a white eraser and I rub that along the stamping surface of those letters. It takes any manufacturing residue off of there, and it will help that ink stick to my stamp a little bit better and get a clearer image. If you ever have a stamp set that you're finding you're having a hard time with, this is usually the solution to get that stamp to stamp better. Usually the issue, especially with new stamps, is manufacturing residue on there wants to resist the ink. I'm using my Misty stamping tool in order to do my stamping so that I can stamp it multiple times to get a nice, clear, full set of sentiments. And then once I'm done, I can use the coordinating die, place it in place, and I like to use some yellow tape to tape it in place to make sure that it's not going to shift in my die cutting machine, and then I can die cut it. Off screen, I also die cut several extra pieces of white cardstock with that die, just so that I can layer those together and get some extra dimension there. And just like other cardstock scraps, most of us have scraps of white as well, so this is a perfect way to use them up. I also took the different colors that I'm using within the card and picked whichever ones I wanted for my layered smile sentiment. Now, I love sentiments that have a shadow behind, and this one is a little bit unique because it has two shadows behind. I haven't actually seen another sentiment like that. There might be out there, but I've never seen it before. So I really love the fact that there are the two shadows. So you can pick and choose if you want to have a single shadow behind it or if you want to do the double shadow. Most of my cards today, I'm using the double shadow because it's new to me. I love it and I couldn't stop. For my last card, I just do one of the shadows just to show the variation. Because I did ink blending on my flowers, I wanted to do a little bit of ink blending on the uppermost sentiment. So I have the purple mist cardstock that I used to do that smile, and I'm using that same Wilted Violet distress ink with an ink blending tool, and I'm just doing the bottom part of it. Like I said, I wanted to get a little bit of an ombre-ish look to it. It adds a little bit of dimension. It makes it a little bit more interesting and unique. And because we have those inks anyways, because we've done the ink blending on the flowers, we might as well pull them out and coordinate that with our sentiment. So with that ink blended, I can take my glue, put it on the back, and glue everything together. And as soon as I pick out my sub-sentiment, I'm ready to start assembling my card. So these sub-sentiments there, they come with 5 in the set. I did them all in black. I did my stamping in black. It's going to coordinate well with pretty much any card you do, but you could also obviously stamp it in a colored ink. I wanted to have the one set and use them for all the cards that I was creating, so I just did a basic neutral color, black, and it will coordinate perfectly with them all. So you can see how having my glue in a fine tip bottle is really helpful for die cuts like this. This one, because there's a lot of jags on the outside, I made sure that every single one of those little strips had some glue on it, and then I put a little bit in the center. As long as that outside is completely glued, the center part doesn't really matter because there's nothing for it to catch on. When I put my die cuts down, I like to use a large acrylic block to hold everything down, make sure it's nice and flat, and it frees up my hands for working on something else. Often what I will do, especially if I have die cuts like this that I want to layer on my cards, is while that is drying, I will assemble everything on top of that acrylic block just to get an idea how I want everything placed. Here it gave me an idea exactly where to place my stems. And then when I go to assemble my card, I know exactly where I wanted all of my die cuts. Sometimes I'll alter it a little bit slightly, but because that acrylic block is clear, I can see right through it. I know that I like the look that I'm going for, and I can confidently start gluing things on my card, knowing that I will likely not change my mind and need to change anything. It's just one little thing, but it's always nice to know that you like the design that you're thinking in your head before you start to glue everything down. I also love using liquid glue for this because if by chance I want to tweak a flower or just move it slightly, I can shimmy things in place, and I can also easily tuck leaves and stuff like that underneath there. So I'm using that same glue for the smile, and then for my sentiments, I'm going to use that same glue and attach the extra die cuts to the bottom for some extra dimension. You could also use a thin foam strip or some foam squares here, but because most of us have extra cardstock and cardstock scraps, this is just a great way to use it up and utilize it and get that same dimension. So at this point, my card is mostly assembled. I just want to add some of those leaves. So I'm going to use that same glue, and I like to tuck them in behind flowers. Because I use that liquid glue, often it will have grabbed the cardstock, but not so much that I can't lift it up if I really wanted to and really have an area that I want those leaves to go. The other thing you can do, if by chance you can't get in very far with those leaves and you really want to tuck them farther, is you could rip the end off. You could cut it off too, but because it's being tucked behind something, you won't see that you ripped it off. So, and it's usually often a little bit quicker. The last step I want to do is add just a little bit of stickles to the centers of the flowers. It's going to add a little bit of extra texture and some sparkle. I often will just put dots there so the dots dry quite quickly. Here I ended up covering it completely because I liked the look of it. I also like how the stickles are opalescent so you can see the color underneath them. While I was waiting for those stickles to dry, I die cut a bunch more die cuts for my second card. I thought these anemones looked like poppies. So my favorite poppy are the ones that are pink, but have the touch of peachy look to them. So I have all of those die cut out of the cardstock that I want. I did the same as the first card where I did a light pink for some of the flowers and white. I'm going to ink blend them with the same color, but because I have the variation of the cardstock, it's just going to give a little bit of variation with the flowers. For this card, I'm using the stitched edge circle die cut to put behind my floral element. I love that this stitched edge circle has two different centers that you can put in there, and they're kind of non-traditional. It's a great way to add a focal point or add a background to your floral image, but they're not, in my opinion, something that you would really expect. So for my ink blending on my die cuts, I used worn lipstick. Now here is the reminder to clean off your ink blending brushes before you do your ink blending. This ended up turning up a lot more orange than I had intended. I think I had orange on my ink blending brush from a previous project. So I went and grabbed some Kitsch Flamingo to add a little bit more pink to it. Really, I know better. I just thought that it was I just wasn't thinking. Really, in all honesty, I wasn't thinking. And for this particular project, it wasn't a mistake that was going to ruin anything. I could have just restarted die cutting those pieces and ink blended them. But I sometimes like things like this that are unexpected, that make you think a little bit creatively and stretch you a little bit. So I decided to go with it, just add that Kitsch Flamingo to it, and it took some of the orange tone off of it. I did the same colors for ink blending the bottom part of my Smile die cut, and then I wanted to change up my background circle a little bit. So I took some Hickory Smoke and just did a little bit of ink blending around the edges. Again, I didn't want a solid color here. If you want a solid color, the best way to do it is using solid cardstock, but by adding that little bit of Hickory Smoke around the outside, it frames it a little bit. It's going to tie in with the centers of my flowers as well. Another reason to do it is to tie different elements in. And I love the look of the white center with the framed gray outline. This piece of cardstock here is going to be used as a backdrop for my card. It's going to be a piece on top of my card base. And I also wanted to have that ink blended, so I used that Hickory Smoke there as well. I'm using a large ink blending tool that has a flat bottom to it. It fits very nicely in the hand, and you can have a little bit more control. It's a great blending tool for larger areas, but if you don't have a brush like this, the same type of brush that I used to ink blend around the circle die cut would work just as well. So once the ink blending is done, because I did some ink blending on my surface here, I want to make sure to clean off all of that ink. So I have a damp cloth here that I used, and I also am drying it off right away. I don't want any moisture on my card base. I have a very light peachy pink card base that I'm using, adding that matte that I had just ink blended, and then I'm adding my stitch circle edge die cut. Because this has the zigzags in it, I want to make sure that I have a little bit of glue on all of those zigzags. So I just did a little dot in each one, or at each one of those points, to make sure that none of those pieces could catch on anything and possibly tear. Once that is glued down, I can start placing everything where I want it to go. So once again, I'm doing that on top of my acrylic block. While I have that there, I'm going to attach the extra layers to my sentiment to give that a little bit of extra dimension so that that can start drying while I am still assembling. So I start laying out my flowers. This time I'm not using the leaves and the stems, I'm only using the flowers. So just because a die cut has leaves and stems, I am going to use the leaves, doesn't mean you actually have to use those stems. You can just use the flower head. Depending on the flower, some die cuts it'll be more appropriate than others. Once I have my placement how I want, I can start gluing these down. Now this die set creates 2 flowers and I had done it twice, so I have 4 flowers here. And at this point I decided I wanted a 5th flower. I typically like odd numbers, and there is a rule with design where odd numbers are better visually than even numbers. So I did one off screen, and that's more the color that I intended for the original flowers. So it is a little bit off colored from the original ones, but it will work just fine. Once I have that down, I can glue down my sentiment and then put that acrylic block on there for it to dry for a few moments. And then I can start tucking in my leaves. Now my leaves, I did do some ink blending with the bundled sage just at the bottom part of the leaf, just to add a little bit of dimension. Most of that's going to be tucked underneath flower petals and whatnot, but you will still see a tiny little bit of that ink blending peeking out. So I can put glue on that, tuck them under the petals. When I glue petals down, I'll typically just glue down the center of the petals. I don't mind if anything flips up or whatnot. And I also know that I like to tuck in leaves and stuff like that. So I will often leave the outer parts so that there is an easy area to glue in those leaves. For my stickles for this card, I'm using some black diamond stickles. I thought it would work perfectly with the dark centers to these flowers, and I really love the sparkle it gives. I wanted to add a little bit of different texture to my smile sentiment here, so I'm just using some glossy accents and covering it completely. This is going to give just a beautiful shine to it. You could also use glossy cardstock and do your ink blending on glossy cardstock, but there's some beautiful dimension as well as the shine that you get from using glossy accents. The one thing you want to keep in mind though is if you do get any bubbles in it while it is still in the liquid form like this, you want to take a pin and you want to pop those bubbles. If you let it dry with those bubbles in there, they're going to be staying there permanently. So because this smile sentiment has 3 different layers to it, sometimes when you're putting glossy accents or even stickles on top of an intricate die cut like this, sometimes it'll go a little bit off of the side. I have a little push pin or a thumbtack here that I keep on my desk for cleaning this up. It's easy to work in your hand, as well as the fact that it has a nice pointed tip so you can clean it up really, really easily. I let that dry completely, and here is the finished card. I love the texture that those stickles give the center of the flowers and the different texture you get from the glossy accents on the sentiment. So while I was waiting for my glossy accents to dry on the last card, I did a little bit of Googling on what flowers look similar to anemones, and I found that cosmos look very similar. So I found some beautiful pink cosmos. I chose a bright pink and kind of a medium colored pink for them, and they have some really pretty yellow centers to it, which add a nice pop of color. So off screen, I did my die cutting for this, and I'm using picked raspberry to ink blend in the center of both of these die cuts. You can't see the picked raspberry a lot on the darker ones, but it is there, and it's going to add just enough shadow. The ink blending is exactly the same as I did for my other cards. I'm also using that picked raspberry at the bottom part of my smile sentiment. You don't have to do your ink blending on your smile sentiment or on your die cuts or your sentiments. I just love the look of dimension it gives. In my next card, I won't do any ink blending so that you can see the difference between a card that has some ink blending and that one that doesn't. Again, it's not absolutely necessary, but I really love the look that it gives. And I have the inks, I have the brushes. It's one of those things that's very simple to do, and I think it's really quite effective and adds so much to the fronts of cards. So once those die cuts are all ink blended, I can start assembling my card. Now, when I die cut the sub-sentiments at the beginning of the video, I noticed that this would probably be a cool stencil to create a background. So I kept it, I trimmed the one side so that I could, when I placed it a second time, I could make sure that it was evenly spaced. And I'm using some mustard seed distress ink to ink blend. Now, because these strips between each one of those openings is so fine, this is not a stencil that's going to last very long. So if you wanted something that was going to last better, you probably could use some Duralar. It would be see-through and it would last. It wouldn't be affected by the ink. The other thing is you could easily see to space your next layer if you wanted to put multiple layers on this. Another thing that could be done with this is using the same die, cutting pieces of cardstock and then just gluing them to your background so that you would get that extra dimension. I just thought by using it as a stencil and ink blending the background with it, it just gave a different look, but it didn't add the extra dimension, but you get the texture from the ink blending. And I made sure when I did my ink blending that it wasn't completely even. I have some areas that are lighter, some that are darker. It just made it a little bit more interesting to me. And this mustard seed is the same color ink that I used to ink blend my flower centers. I assembled my flowers off screen because they're the same assembly as the first two cards, so it didn't need the repetition, and I can start assembling my cards. So I have a white card base here. I used the same pink that I used for those dark pink anemones for my mat, and then I have white for the center. I'm going to glue everything in place, and I'm going to keep my placement fairly similar to my first card. I really liked how they looked. The only thing here is I'm going to use 3 flowers instead of 4. Like I said, for my second card, I like the look of odd numbers, and as I was assembling this, initially I thought I was going to do all 4 flowers, but as I was assembling this, I thought, you know what, I think 3 would look better. And just because I have 4 flowers here ready doesn't mean I need to use all 4. And what I'll probably do is keep that last one and I will just do a card with a single flower on it. That will look beautiful as well. Once I have those flowers done, I can put my smile sentiment down and then I can start tucking in the leaves. Now, I'm using the leaves that come with this die set. They're not necessarily the same leaves that are for Cosmos. I didn't even look at what the leaves would look like. But in my opinion, if you're giving this card to someone and they have the courage or audacity to tell you that those aren't the correct leaves, well, they're probably not really appreciating what you went through creating a card for them. So I don't mind that the leaves may not be right. I know that they're wrong for poppies, but again, I don't mind. I thought the nice pop of green looks nice on there. And again, if someone's going to point out that it's the wrong leaves on there, they're not appreciating a handmade card. So while that's drying, I added my sub-sentiment here. And of course, I'm going to add some stickles to the center of the flowers because I love the sparkle. It's a step that you don't need to add. I just personally like that sparkle and that dimension. And apparently I didn't film the dried card, but we'll see it again at the end of the video. So my fourth card here, I'm going to use the layered iris die set, and I'm going to create an iris card. Now this mat here that I have is one that I created for the first card, and I had intended to use it as a mat for that. And then I changed my mind on the design without really thinking too much, so I saved the mat for a future card. So I have all of my pieces die cut. I just did my die cutting off screen. It's very similar to die cutting for the first card. The cool thing with the iris is it has a few layers in it, and when you die cut the large part of the flower, it leaves an impression telling you exactly where this piece here that I'm holding in my hand goes. When I lift the die cut up closer to the screen, you can see that there is an impression left that shows you the exact placement of that piece. So it makes it really easy for the assembly to know where that piece is going to go and just adds a neat highlight to it. Now this is the card where I'm just using straight die cuts. I'm not doing any ink blending, but you could certainly add that step if you wanted to add that to it. Ink blending adds some nice dimension to it, but you can see that it is just as effective and beautiful using these die cuts without any ink blending to them. Once again, I'm grabbing that jewel picker in order to help place some of these tiny die cuts, because some of these pieces for the center of the flowers or for the details on the flowers are really quite tiny. So by having that jewel picker, it makes it really easy to place them. And this jewel picker is actually easier to place some of these pieces than it would be to use a pair of tweezers and try to lift up, especially those really tiny yellow pieces. That jewel picker worked beautifully, and when you put it on top of the glue, it releases them really easily. Whereas sometimes with tweezers, especially for tiny, tiny pieces, sometimes you get that tweezers inside the glue while you're placing it, and it makes it a little bit harder to let go of that die cut. So this jewel picker worked perfectly. For my spotlight frame circle here, there's a plain circle in that die set. I use that to cut a piece of the light purple cardstock to put behind that to tie in those colors. And now we can start assembling our flower. I think it's very easy to know exactly where the little pieces can go for this die set or to place it on the front of your card, but you can always use the front of the packaging in order to place them if you need a little bit of help. Once I have my stem and my flower down, I can start putting the leaves down. I did my leaf placement for this one the same as the front of the packaging, but you can certainly change it up. And I like the fact that the leaves are separate so that you can get a little bit custom with it. You can change it up if you want them placed a little bit differently. I chose the 3 different purples that I used in this card for doing my layered sentiment here. We're going to layer them all together. And then when I place them on my card, I'm going to add some stickles to them. So this is just going to add sparkle all over the top layer of that smile sentiment. I'm using an opalescent stickles, so it lets that color of the cardstock shine through. I also put a little bit of that stickles in the center of the flowers as well. You could, if you wanted, instead of using stickles for this, if you didn't want the mess, you could easily die cut some glitter cardstock with it. The thing I like about the stickles though is because it's got such a fine tip, you can put it exactly where you want it to go. And then I will typically put stickles on something and then I will go do something else in my house for a while so that I don't accidentally mess anything up. Using something like this, which is a glitter glue, is much easier than using loose glitter for those that don't necessarily love having loose glitter in the house, but it gives that beautiful sparkle. And I use that same push pin in order to clean up my stickles around the sentiment. Once again, sometimes it'll go off of the edge a little bit, and having something to easily clean it up works perfectly. You could also use a die pick for this. I find this push pin works perfectly because I have it there all the time. It's just a handy tool to have, and one that probably most of us have in our houses anyways. So here is the card with the dried stickles. I love that you can see the purple cardstock through it, but it adds some beautiful texture as well as some gorgeous sparkle to it. Now the last card I wanted to do, I looked at this iris die set and I kind of thought it looked a little bit like an orchid. Now not one of those ones that are really full and round, one of the ones that are a little bit more spiky. My favorite orchids are the ones that are pink, so I'm using some pink colors in order to color it. I have just very light pink cardstock that I use for the flower base, and the ink colors that I'm using to do the ink blending are Kitsch Flamingo and Picked Raspberry. I'm also going to pull in some Tombow markers in order to do some of those details to have a little bit extra control. So the markers I have here are 755 as well as 772. I'll have them listed in the supply list in the description as well as all the other supplies that I'm using. Using these Tombow markers, they have a fine tip as well as a brush tip. So I can use that fine tip to get all those little dots that orchids often have, or the ones that I typically see often have. Now I do not have a green thumb. I have a hard time keeping things alive. So creating flowers like this is perfect for me because I don't have to keep these alive. I can just create pretty flowers. I'm not using every single one of the extra pieces from the iris die set in order to create the orchid. I just pick and chose ones that I wanted to use. With this large piece in the center of the flower, there are some smaller pieces that go with it that are actually buds. I chose not to use them for this card, but you certainly could add it to it. And the stems for the iris are obviously a little bit different than they would be for an orchid, but I don't think those details really matter too much. The final accent there was I added a white Posca pen and just added some dots to it. I'm also using the Spotlight Circle die set in order to create a focus point on the background. This time though, I used the different center for that center. There's one that looks a little bit more lattice like this, and then there's that zigzag one. And it's really easy to swap out the die set for that center. I do use my yellow tape in order to tape it in place to make sure that it stays exactly where I want it to go. Now I chose this yellow for something bright and because it tied into the little tiny accents in the flowers. If you wanted something a little bit more subtle, you could do this die cut in white and then just use this yellow behind it so that you'd have less of that color. It would be a great way to get that same pop of color on that background, but be a little bit more subtle. Now, I know when you have orchids, they typically will have multiple blooms on them. I chose to just do one here because the flower is quite large. I kind of thought putting multiple blooms might be a little bit too much on the front of the card, so I chose something a little bit more simple. And when I place my leaves, I'm placing them over the stems that were intended for those little buds. I wanted to hide them a little bit. If you wanted, you could also just snip them off just to put those leaves down, but I had them all glued down before I really thought about it. The other thing you could do is just use some of that light pink cardstock and put those buds there. Again, it wouldn't look exactly the same way an actual orchid plant or ones that I have seen look anyways, but just a way to go with the stems that are included in the set. So I added that smile. You can see that I only did 2 of the layers for this one, just for something a little bit different. So just because the smile has 3 layers, and I love that it has 3 layers, doesn't mean you need to use all of them. The other thing with this video, I kept the florals very simple. I have Lisa Horton interference ink pads and I've used them in many different videos, and I have an idea for using them with this collection, but I wanted to keep that for a separate video because it's a completely different style for what I created with these cards, but I can't wait to play with them with that. So hopefully this has given you a little bit of inspiration on what to do with the Spotlight Frames and Floral die sets. I love sets where you can take the main shape and create different things with this. So for the iris, we did an iris as well as an orchid. And then for the anemone, we did an anemone as well as a poppy, as well as a cosmos. Things like this, when you have die sets that you can do multiple things with, in my opinion, it just gives them a lot more value and a lot more things that you can do with them. And it just sparks the creativity a little bit more. I love the uniqueness of the frames behind this collection. They're not something that I typically will work with, but I can't wait to play with them more in the future. Thank you so much for spending your time with me today. I really appreciate you being here. Have a fantastic day.